My name's Storm Heater. I'm from the Department of Modern Language, Philosophy, and Religion. It's my job tonight to introduce Dr. Laura Kieselbach. She joined the Department of English in 2016. Her specialties are diversity literature and culturally responsive pedagogy. She did her undergraduate degree at Penn State. She received a master's degree from the University of Central Florida, and then went on to get her doctoral degree at Northeastern University in Boston. Her dissertation work was on the role of diversity literature and dynamic curriculum. Now, she developed her passion for diversity literature as a high school and middle school English teacher. Tonight, she'll be talking to us about diversity literature and the role of a dynamic curriculum. Can we please welcome Dr. Laura Kieselbach.
All right, so I have some specific guidelines on where I'm supposed to stand, and I apologize in advance when I break the rules because I have a hard time staying still. So thank you all for coming out to begin with. And those of us that are teachers or going to be teachers, we know how plans don't always go as we anticipate. And so the first thing I tried to do was print my notes before coming over here, and it wouldn't print. So I fortunately had a student running madly over to Stroud to print them for me, and they just arrived. So I just want to say thank you all for being here. Thank you to faculty, to administrators, to students who came out. What I intend to talk about tonight with you is some cultural perceptions of learning and teaching, and that encompasses diversity literature, and that accompanies practices in the classroom. What I asked you to do on your way in was pick up 2 sheets from the back table. One is titled a Sociogram, and one is titled a Mindset Survey. So we're going to go through those and talk about those a little bit. I would like to draw your attention up here. So a few of us from the faculty went on a conference trip very recently. And look, this is already coming out anyway. So am I on? Okay. So he was our keynote speaker, Chris Emden. He has a great book for white teachers who teach in the hood and the rest y'all too. So that's the title of his book, and he was our dynamic keynote speaker. So I want to point to his quote: "Students quickly receive the message that they can only be smart when they are not who they are. This, in many ways, is classroom colonialism, and it can only be addressed through a very different approach to teaching and learning." So the core of my research is culturally relevant teaching, or culturally relevant pedagogy, or culturally responsive teaching. Any name it goes by, it intends to serve the same purpose, and that is to make the practice of education more meaningful and purposeful to our students, who are the most important ones in the classroom, right? They do come first. So the sociogram, before we get to the sociogram, let me stop right here. This is overwhelming. I promise not every slide looks like this. I promise, this is just one. I want to read this to you, and I want to read it to you for a reason. You don't have to read it. This is my reminder to include it. When we start research as academics, as individuals who feel called to a cause, we need a purpose, and we need a purpose that is driven by our passion. And so when I began teaching in a classroom, it was a very urban setting. It was a very different setting than what I had grown up in. It was a very different classroom than I had the pleasure of sitting in as a student. They looked different than me, they spoke different than me, they learned different from me. And I realized right away that I needed to teach different if I was going to get them to buy in. I couldn't necessarily teach different until I had the tools, the resources, and the curriculum that allowed me the opportunity to teach different. So when I began my endeavor in a doctoral program, this was my purpose. So this was what I identified as my problem of practice, and what drove all of the research that came thereafter since 2014 on this particular endeavor. I'm an English teacher, and so secondary English is the focus of my research and the impetus of it, but it is not the only place in which we can practice culturally relevant teaching, so I do want to premise it by saying that. Secondary English language arts classes utilize limited texts rooted in multicultural literature and student diversity. Refraining from the study of these texts, which offer a new and enriched perspective on marginalized populations, can limit students' understanding of cultures beyond their own. In addition, it creates an absence or a void for those students who never see themselves represented in literature. The problem has persisted for decades. In 1969, the Coretta Scott King Award was created to promote understanding and appreciation of the culture of all peoples and their contribution to the realization of the American dream. The award intended also to foster racial diversity of authors and also subject matter. Today, there remains a need for complex issues of race and ethnicity to appear in literature in order for students to understand there are multiple truths and should, therefore, question the dominant interpretations of society. Arlene Berry asserts that children between the ages of 3 and 4 are aware of the status assigned to them by race and sex from the books that are read to them. 3 and 4, that is incredibly young for a child to already be shapen into the perspective of who they are intended to grow up as. This being the case, it is more essential than ever that students are exposed to all types of literature in order to have a wider view of the national experience despite their cultural isolation. So that has been my focus, my purpose, and my drive essentially throughout this work that I've done. And so tonight, as we talk about cultural perceptions of learning and teaching, 4 words we all know as educators, administrators, as students in the classroom, all of these words on their own are words. They make sense, you can define them, you know them. But when we stack them and look at them through a lens of intention and purpose to change something, we take a look at cultural as of or relating to the practice or habits of people, right? As teachers, we see students enter our classroom and they have a culture of their own. Perception is the way that we regard something, and so that perception is often informed or colored or sometimes clouded by whatever our previous lived experiences are. Learning, the knowledge acquired through experience, and teaching to cause to know something, to guide the studies of, right? So if I'm charged with the task of guiding the studies of somebody who is very different based on their lived experiences, how do I make the connection? How do I bridge the gap? So I implore you to look at these words through a more purposeful and intentional lens. So to get started, on the way in, I asked you to pick up a sociogram. So has anybody not grabbed one? Okay. Oh, okay. So Dr. Heater and Dr. Ball are going to make sure we get them on each side. So this is a practice I use in my classroom, so if you're a student of mine, you've seen this before, but it's still super important for you to engage with this activity tonight because we're doing it for a different purpose. So a sociogram is a practice, and what I love about professional development, what I love about conferences and workshops and the willingness to continue to grow professionally is I get to learn really neat activities like this that really expose me to what my students come to the classroom with and what they come without and what I face the students with and without. So a sociogram, and I looked up the definition so I had it verbatim for you. A charting of the interrelationships within a group. Its purpose is to discover group structure, i.e. the basic network of friendship patterns and subgroup organizations. The relations of any one child to the group as a whole are another type of information which can be derived from a sociogram. So I asked you to take a few minutes as you were sort of getting settled to fill this out, and I'm going to pause now and I'm going to ask you to take not a lot of time, but start thinking about the people you know. And so those people you know, you list them on the left-hand side. And the things they know, what they know, the expertise they have goes on the right side. So there's no right or wrong. Like if you don't put your mom or dad on this list, I won't tell them it's okay. If you only list your friends, that's okay. We won't tell your teachers. Like it does not matter who you put on this list. It could be your dentist, it could be your doctor, it could be your neighbor, it could be your dog walker. If they have an area that they are experts in and you know them, you know that you can gain knowledge from them or have access to information through them, they should go on your list. Okay? So take about 2 minutes, 3 minutes, just we're going to use it for a point of discussion, so at least you have something on there. So I'm just going to ask you for about another minute to add any last minute names on that list. All right, so finish writing the name, their knowledge, their expertise. And I want to point out, one comment was made, like, I know too many people, and the older we are, and the more we've traveled, and the more we've experienced, the longer our list gets. But as educators, we have students coming to us that have very short lists. And so I would like for you to take a few minutes, because Dr. Heater said dynamic classroom practices. So I don't like to do all the talking. I want you to do some of the talking. So I'm going to ask you to just chat with people around you, whether it's a neighbor or 2 or 3 people or 4 people, number is irrelevant, and ask them or talk to them about what patterns you're seeing on this list, about people you know, about information you have access to. So I invite that conversation now. Good to see you. Converse. It's my microphone. It's the microphone. Are you spying on her list? She's still writing. She's not paying attention to the rules. What class of hers do you guys still have? FYE? FYE? Okay. Oh, okay. Excellent. Garrison? No, it's the Glenn? All right, good. Good to know. Thanks. And then you started. All the best camping spots in the area. So you're my expert. Just as we were walking in and I had to get set up, so after, yes, I would love to. Oh, so... Yeah, Holly plays in person. Yeah. I haven't seen them since that Christmas 3 years ago. Yeah, because where we were at Carrie's, his mom fell ill. There was just a lot of things happened at once, so they haven't had a big family Christmas.
Jasmine, better writing techniques.
Well, I'm not. My
Jasmine inspires me every day. Like her blog, like all these things. I'm like, I want to do it. Like, I want to do this. How can we live or copy from her? She can, I mean, whatever she's doing, I want to do.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could invite you back to the conversation. I would like to ask for volunteers if somebody from your group would like to share a little bit about patterns you were discovering, or if you noticed. So I'll give an example, and I don't know that Sarah's here, but a student of mine is an education major, and as she was doing her list, she was like, wow, all the women in my family are teachers, and then all of the women on my dad's side of the family are all nurses, and so it's no wonder she's in education and health and PE education. So it's about wellness and education, which she has been surrounded by her entire life. So coincidence, maybe, or maybe not. Like subconsciously, that's what she's been exposed to in terms of knowledge and skill set her entire life. So are you noticing any patterns about the sort of people you know or the sort of information you have access to? So I know a few names in the room, so because I know your name, you might be my target. Margaret, what did you guys notice?
Well, the 3 of us in our discussion all recognized we were recognizing family members and what they knew. Because I'm older than them, I got to key into so many of my friends who are specialists in the arts, but I have nieces and nephews who've gone into very different fields than myself. And so I have connections now because of them
To new
into
things.
health services and things like that.
Excellent. Cassie, what did you guys discover?
I noticed that what people have taught me shapes like why I like school so much and why I am an education major. Like I have my mom taught me discipline, and Dr. E taught me about writing, and another teacher I've had taught me how to study. So all three of those combined kind of helped me within my major.
Excellent. Terry.
Everyone on my list is predominantly in education, some way, shape, or form. Everybody, with the exception of one on my list, are white. Everybody is middle class. So those are the patterns that I noticed.
And thank you for not being afraid to say that out loud, because that's something that we sometimes fail to give voice to, the recognition of those patterns about who we know. They're white, they're mostly men, they're mostly women, they're mostly wealthy, they're mostly poor. So those sort of ideas sometimes escape the acknowledgement of the patterns that we have. And so why would we use one of these in the classroom? What might it benefit us to know about our students? How can this shape our understanding of the students who are sitting in front of us? Jan, can I ask your feedback on that?
I'm just thinking how my list has different types of behaviors. Like some are specific skills, like the guy who fixes my faucet who showed me how to do it rather than charge me to do it. Or my great nephews who teach me to find excitement in little things, and my friend Gail who always says, forgive and accept. I mean, those are two widely different things that we learn from different people.
And so how many of our students have those accesses to those sorts of messages or those sorts of people? So this can help us begin to understand what we gain from this is an acknowledgement of our social capital. Our social capital are the things we have to bargain with, or the things we have to pass through life with greater ease. So as educators, we unfortunately often overlook the capital we have, or how we have used our capital to scaffold our own development and our own growth. And students, when we ask them about their capital, they often find that their lists are small and they feel very underconnected, particularly to notions of success that are promoted at their schools, whether it's universities or high schools or middle schools or even elementary schools. They often feel like what they consider their version of success does not align with the mass assumption of what success should look like. So here's a chart. And this talks about the types of capital that we have. And so we're focused down here about social capital, the types of relationships that we have or have access to. But we also have financial and human capital, or cultural capital, right? And so power is cultivated through the more capital that we have. And so one of the things as educators, when we're talking about the cultural perceptions of learning and teaching, our students are coming to us with massively different packages of capital. So it's important that as educators, we begin to culturally understand and interpret what that capital means for them and what they have access to, so that we can begin to sort of amend what our expectations are. And I say that a lot, and I want to premise it with this, or substantiate it with this, since I'm saying it after. That does not mean we lower our expectations of performance. It means that we alter our expectations of what it looks like, how we deliver it, and what the tangible or the deliverable is that comes out of it from different students. So students learn differently, live differently, and act differently, and it's important we acknowledge that. So what we want to talk about a little bit, what I would like to talk about, is the evolving capital. So just because something's on that list, and somebody said I could write for hours, and when it was provided to me, the suggestion was add to it over days. And as an assignment to my students, I said add to it throughout the semester. As you think of somebody like, oh, I know so-and-so, and they have access to this. That can be my avenue to that too. And so I've asked them to continuously add to it over time. So the capital can be evolving. We can add to it. It's not a fixed sense. So as educators, we can contribute to their capital. And so that's the evolving perception of what our role is, or what our job is. And so how do we situate that in the classroom, right? One way to think about this is SATs, right? And so I'm grateful somebody sort of broke the ice about race and about sex and about culture and all of that, right? So the SAT was crafted in 1926 by an older white gentleman. Okay? 1926, a lot of our black students' families and heritages and roots weren't reading yet. Yet we're assessing them using that same standardized version of tests, and I'm not negating it, I'm not suggesting that there shouldn't be a form of that, but I'm saying there should be alternative options as well. So they are from a very different cultural background where reading and writing was not always valued because it wasn't always an option. And so now that it's this standardized expectation, they don't have the capital that their peers might have. They don't have as much access. The longevity of their access prior to now is not as fruitful. It's not as meaningful. It's not as deep. So we can't build their capital alone, but we can provide them opportunities to build that capital. So why do they need this capital and where do they need it most? So these are quotes that I want you to reflect on. I'm going to ask you to share with one another about them. These are from students as part of my own research and part of my own dissertation. So these are students who feel like they lack capital, students who feel like they're not heard, students who feel like they are being overlooked. So I'll read them to you, although you can read them as well. Why is it that teachers want us all to talk white? They have classes and things for students who learn Spanish before standard English, but don't offer nothing for the rest of us. My first language is Black English. That's the way we be talking in my house. Why is no one talking about that? Agree or disagree, there's enough research out there that supports the fact that Black English is a language. I am terrified of white people. I jump when y'all walk by because I was taught a white whatever walks by, you move out of the way. Man, woman, kid, you were in their space, always. A cop nearby, you take the hoodie down and show your hands. A white kid in your class says you did something, then you did it. A teacher calls you out, you say okay and don't talk back. So why I jump when you walk by? You are the very thing that scares me the most. High school students. This is how they feel inside their classroom. These are the things that they report to their teachers, and teachers have reported to me through dialogue and conversation. Those are two powerful and terrifying quotes. So I would like for you to take a few minutes and talk about your reactions to these with your neighbors, with who's ever nearby, same groups you were discussing in earlier. And I would love to hear back from you what your input is or what your reactions are. And go.
And cut.
And go.
Yes, it's mostly I feel bad for the person who's not that because they're obviously feeling maybe I'm just sitting on my face, you know. I like just go I like stop and that's what I mean. That's my biggest fear is like, I'm terrified of having my picture taken. I jump when you walk by because I don't look good in pictures.
And that's what yes. But no, I'm with you on the first one. The second one, the first one we can talk to me. The second one is
I feel bad for that, and it's and I feel like the second one I feel like I understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, I totally agree. Especially the teacher calls me out and say okay, so you hop back. I mean, I think that's
I just say okay.
Even if they're in the right, I can see them just acquiescing. You don't want to be a troublemaker. You don't want to. You're right. You don't want to get in the room.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's the one that's really troubling to me.
So again, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to hear some of your reactions. We'll take them one at a time. And so somebody did ask from when these quotes were. And so my research is fairly new. From the time of 2014 to 2018 is when I was heavily invested in digging through the research. And every participant in my research has been teaching for no more than 10 years within the same district that has seen an evolving student demographic. A particular district that has gone from, at one point, 23% non-white identified students to 57% non-white identified students. So it's been through this transition and over the past 10 years. So these are not from 1992. These are not from the 80s or the 70s or even early 2000s. So this is within the last decade. So they're very recent quotes, so they're not dated, they're not old. And so it's important that we acknowledge that this still exists, this is still out there. So I would love to hear from somebody, and I'll take a volunteer rather than call anybody out. Yes?
Like it depends on the area and then also the person to an extent, because like you have people who are very open and friendly when they're walking, they wouldn't, like the second coat, they wouldn't have their hoodie up or anything. And also like the situation with the area where they live is different, so it's like a different take on like the condition of the city than somewhere in a country.
And this young man moved to the Pocono area from the city. So a lot of his experience was learning how to adapt to his society in the city, and now he's here, and he's almost cultural isolation. He's definitely outside of what he has grown used to. So somebody else, let me hear some reactions to the text itself. Go ahead.
Well, being from the Poconos, I can relate with this some. Back in 9th grade, we actually had a teacher who talked a lot about race. And I think it was a lot because there were transplants from New York City, and having that understanding of the people around you who are coming in and not understanding that East Stroudsburg is a totally different place than in inner New York City. We're totally free here from any discrimination. I mean, there is some still, but it's a lot less, I feel. But just being aware of all of that, and I'm always aware of different people who come in, and whenever I see this kind of thing, I think it's just not right. Like, there's no reason for people to feel that way. And my teacher was a female who was black, and she made it very clear, like, we will not have any racial discriminations in the classroom, and you respect me, so you respect everyone else. And seeing this is just really sad to think that people have to feel that way because they shouldn't have to.
Agreed. And so I have a lot of teachers in the room. I have future English teachers. I have current English teachers, professors. So can I ask you, the first quote there, how do you feel as an educator who teaches writing, how do you feel about this notion that there's a form of Black English, and how do we bridge that gap or fill that space to allow students to speak their way but write academically?
I think part of the, like whenever I'm talking to my students about how they speak, my kind of pat response to them is, my job is to make you as successful as possible, and I want you to put the best face forward with the first words that come out of your mouth. And I always bring it back to using an object pronoun as the subject. I said, you're never going to say, me went to the mall, but you always say, like, me and my friends went to the mall. So it's trying to make them, like, job forward. But Brooke and I were having a conversation that what we consider to be professional is evolving over time. So at some point in time, we as the educators need to accept the fact that that professional standard is going to change and shift and may look different for other people.
Anybody else? So on the other side of the aisle, if I use that terminology, are the teachers. And so these were two really interesting quotes from teachers that I received during our conversations. When my very white Italian Catholic family found out my cousin was marrying a Black man, they were concerned, they were shocked. I mean, we're not racist, but it was weird to us. She is so pretty and smart, and people like my grandparents couldn't understand. But they're not racist. Growing up, there wasn't much cultural diversity because where I grew up was rural as could be. We drove tractors to school during Spirit Week and we ate scrapple. The first bit I really got was when I was teaching. Yeah, adulthood really. I mean, I saw some of the other stuff during college, but very limited. So take a minute and talk about the teachers you have had. Are they these teachers, right? Because sometimes, and the first quote here is not by, I've seen him in the classroom. He's an amazing teacher, and he connects with his students, and I think sometimes we don't even know our own ignorances when we make statements like that. So I would like to hear from you guys after you discuss a little bit. Do you know a teacher like this? Are you the teacher like this that might not even be aware of your own biases or your own blind spots? As educators, we talk about our blind spots, what we know and what we don't know, and do we know the difference? So take a minute to do that as well, please.
I love our hesitance. We're like, can we talk about this?
Yeah. What's funny though is that a lot of white people don't realize we eat white people. We eat ethnic food. Scrapple is ethnic food. The PB&J is ethnic food. But it's ethnic is something that whites apply to people of color, you know, and so there might not be that much diversity. Right.
Yeah, you're right.
Right.
I think the use of scrapple here is more about how backlash is. Scrapple unless it becomes like a...
Yeah. So I tried it just to try it one time.
And so it's a very effective skill.
And driving tractors, eating your scrapple. I got no scrapple came in a can, yeah. But, yeah. Not much diversity, but it's like, well, they were diverse for the city, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's American white rules.
I mean,
Oh, there were bubbles in my schools. Most pretty much until high school, all the schools I went to were pretty white.
yeah, I mean, we had
Neighborhoods were white. They were
right.
red.
Yeah, we had one
Right. I mean, I remember them because they were different. Right. One person, yeah, Jewish.
Right? I know they're modern projects there. I mean, we even had that standpoint of, okay, this is all we had.
All right, ladies and gentlemen.
All right.
It's a good thing I don't have a microphone. I'm exceptionally loud. Wow. Sorry, Sin. All right, so can we acknowledge that sometimes maybe we are our guy or gal, keeping anonymity. Number one, sometimes we're almost ignorant to our own blind spots. Is that something, right? So I see a few nods like, yes, that's quite possible. Any comments or feedback on either of these quotes? I have a hand in the back.
I know I grew up at the high school that had Spirit Week where we drove in tractors and had a whole day dedicated to farmers.
But it could be absolutely anywhere, so it's not necessarily the same.
True.
But
I did grow up with that, and that definitely made it weird because only certain types of people would dress up for that day or participate in that day because they were the only ones who had the culture to kind of back it up.
the culture to back it up. And so then imagine when this individual gets into a classroom and they've never had a black neighbor, they've never had maybe a Muslim friend, right? They've had other white farm boys riding tractors and eating scrapple. So what a culture shock to walk into a classroom and suddenly be like, okay, they're not all going to learn like I do. They're not all going to be who I was. And so I need to learn and understand their culture. And so that's sort of what I would love for you to kind of take away from this particular quote is that sometimes who we are is miles away from who our students are that are sitting in front of us. So how do we become a learning community when there's that much difference in our own lived experiences? And so it's about closing that gap more so than about comparing, well, I drove a tractor, well, I did. It's more about, okay, so you did and I didn't, now what? Okay? And so from the field, some researchers, so 3 of the researchers I have hinged all of my, not all of, but the core of, because they're phenomenal women in the field doing research. Gloria Ladson-Billings is the woman who has claimed the name culturally relevant pedagogy. And so she is sort of the impetus for all of this. She is the seminal author on a lot of this. And so she says to do this in the classroom, to bridge those gaps and acknowledge we are different, but now what? I want you to question why we are different. We have different access back to our social capital. So how do we question that inequality, the racism, the injustices that exist within our society? Bell Hooks here talks about, and so back to that teacher, I'll help you out there. Back to that teacher who said, my cousin married a black man and he's nice, but we were all like, what? But we're not racist, right? Bell Hooks says, many teachers who do not have difficulty releasing old ideas may still be resolutely attached to the old ways of teaching. Even those of us who are experimenting with progressive pedagogical practices still are afraid to change. So a lot of us in this room are acknowledging we need to teach differently. Like, our professional standards are changing. English, we need to let them know that, like, speaking is one thing and writing is another, and how do we change academia, right? It's scary and it's difficult and it doesn't happen in a snap, right? And so Bell Hooks is suggesting that even those of us that are the most progressive in our thinking and that want change the most have a hard time implementing it because we still have a particular way of doing things. And then Geneva Gay, the themes that run through all of my teachings and other interactions with students are, we are partners in a quest for learning. And the better we can combine our resources, the better all of us will be. So I have a set of social capital that I come to the classroom with, so do my students. And so what can I gain from their capital and what can they gain from mine? How can we share our capital to become something more and something even greater? And so one of the suggestions here, and I have her name up here, Dr. Etta Hollins, suggests that as educators, we invest and engage in a lifelong practice of RIQ, which is reflective, interpretive, and question. So we reflect on our daily practice. We reflect, and this isn't just for educators. So for those of you in the room that aren't going to be educators when you finish here at ESU and go out as warrior teachers, for those of you that are here as a community member or somehow connected to an educator or simply here as an administrator or staff, if you're not in the classroom practicing this every day, it doesn't mean you can't still stop and reflect. How did an interaction with somebody in society go for you? Because they were different, or you didn't understand them, or they looked different. And so I'll share this, and my students, we shared a little bit about this on Thursday or Tuesday. I'm forgetting the day of the week, but the last time we met. And so I had students fill out a list of music, songs they would like to hear when they come into the classroom. Some of the songs that represent their culture that they would like to jam to, their power song, I probably wouldn't play it with my children around, right? It wasn't necessarily kid-friendly, maybe not even classroom appropriate. And so the question becomes, I have to reflect, do I play that music? And then I have to ask myself, well, why not? It's their culture. They chose these songs. I'm going to take 5 minutes from my class and give it to them through music. What's the harm in that? An interesting dialogue ensued with other people who are and are not in the field of education. And those invested in education were like, go for it. And those that weren't, they were like, you should nix this idea right now. These songs are not good. There are clean versions of them out there. You need to play those. And I had to reflect, do I give them that space to be them? And then interpretive. Interpret how my students are responding to that practice. Interpret how the lesson went, how the class went, how that 5 minutes of giving them time played out. And then, of course, question, like, was it the right thing to do? So it's a constant reflective practice that you are engaged in as an educator. And if you're not or not intending to be one, it's still a practice you can engage in and grow from as a community member, as a citizen, as a participant in society. And so as educators, here are some things that we can do. So I talk a lot about culturally relevant teaching. And you might hear, as I said, culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally responsive teaching, culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally responsive environments. There are a lot of ways to say, let's make things intentional. Let's make things relevant. Let's talk about their culture and make it important in the classroom for their benefit. Another way to do this is inclusive curriculum. And another way, and I'm without stepping on any toes, I'd like to acknowledge that recently, and it was last year in the fall, because we discussed this in my teaching of English class, there was a motion, I'm not sure, I didn't follow it, maybe because it was frustrating, I probably should have, to remove Hillary Clinton and Helen Keller from their history books in the state of Texas. Hillary, I understand she made some people upset recently, but Helen Keller, who has she harmed, right? Who has she offended to the point where they want to remove her from the history books? And so when we talk about telling history from the side of the victor, most history books, most stories we read, it's the victor's story. So how do you start talking about context, about historical events, about brutalities of our past without telling the victor's version, but telling the other version, right? Back to my problem of practice. It is important students know there is more than one truth. And so they're only getting one version that the school says they're supposed to get because that's in their curriculum, that's been approved by somebody who's not them and doesn't understand the culture that is them. So we can't teach what we don't know, right, is our common thread throughout this. And so culturally relevant, responsive pedagogy, it consists of using that cultural knowledge, that prior experience, that prior knowledge that students are bringing with them to the classroom. Research shows that through a more culturally friendly, culturally relevant atmosphere, behavior problems are reduced. So when we saw our speaker at our conference recently, Chris Emden, he had said, and I'm not nearly as cool as him, so it will sound much different coming from me, but he said, you know, students come from a communal space. They're in the hallways, they're talking, they're laughing, they're having fun, and then they come into this classroom, and they're like, stop, sit down, be quiet, get out a pencil, do your at the bell, don't talk, right? But they're like, time out, what? Like they can't shift or turn it off that quickly. His suggestion is, we let them get turned up before they tune in. And so maybe music does that for the first 5 minutes. Maybe you find a way to just say, hey, tell me one thing you did this weekend. So whatever it is, but there are reduced behavior problems because now students feel, I have space. I have a space where somebody cares, somebody wants to hear, somebody is listening. And so they're less likely to act out in behavioral problems. There are stronger bonds with their teacher, naturally. And as a result of that, they tend to invest more in their school as well. Enhanced learning, because now they feel like they matter. So now they want to, and not like in a like people-pleasing kind of way, but they want to make you proud because you have given them some of your attention that they didn't have before. And finally, there's increased self-esteem. When a kid feels valued, when a student feels important, oh my goodness, what they can do with that is amazing. So we're talking a lot about students and how they adapt to the classroom and how they adapt to learning, but here's what we didn't talk about. Can educators do this? So those of us that are in education classes, have taken education classes, teach in a classroom, work on a campus with a classroom, you have probably heard the term growth mindset. And so when we talk about growth mindset, it's this definition here by Dweck. In a growth mindset, people believe that their most basic abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work. Brains and talent are just the starting point. This view creates a love of learning and a resilience that is essential for great accomplishment. And so back to bell hooks, like even those of us that want to implement change in the classroom, can we? Are we ready? What's our mindset? Are we fixed on this notion that standard English is the only way to write, it's the only way people will ever view you professionally, you have to learn it? Or is this notion that like, maybe there's some flexibility? And so the second item I asked you to pick up was a mindset inventory. Uh-oh. Uh-oh, you don't want to know your mindset, or uh-oh, we forgot those two?
Yep.
We forgot those two? All right. So we'll get some of those. Are there more? You got them? Thank you very much.
Okay. Where was the announcement that we needed?
How many questions?
Before you got here, there was a little slide up there to pick up your two handouts. So yeah.
All right, so 10 questions. If you don't have one, I have a student coming around with plenty of extras. So if you would kindly take a few minutes and figure out what is your mindset. Are you fixed or are you willing to grow? I'll take a chunk and get this side.
Tell us the trick. Okay, got it. Erase.
Do you need one?
I see how.
Over there.
I see what's up. Okay,
I'll take
fine.
another
I'll
chunk.
go with the thing that I believe, and I'm gonna be in trouble.
I didn't see the notice, so I have no idea.
You guys are all so great for playing along with my handouts. Of course you did. Thank you. Thank you. There you go. Two. Anybody else? My students, sorry, you're not kids, young men, you're adults, full adults. Anybody else? When you're done answering the questions, go ahead and total them up and see down below where your score falls. No, I do need water though. RJ, are you guys done back there? You guys done? Ryan. Ryan. No, thank you.
I agree or I disagree, and so I got a problem.
I'm taking it like 7.
Oh, and I'm sort of like, sort of in the middle.
All right, so how many people find that they have a strong growth mindset? A strong growth mindset. Of course, right? That's why you're here. How many people feel like they have some growth, but they also have some fixed ideas? How many people have found that they are more fixed, but they got a few growth ideas going on? How many feel that they are in a strong fixed mindset? Their numbers gave them a strong fixed mindset. How many people don't really want to answer that question? Okay. All right. So we're always asking students to change their mindset, to change their perspective, to consider how they might grow. And so it's important as educators that we too are willing to do that. Being in the classroom for many years, I get a lot of the, well, I've always done it this way, and it works. Well, but it doesn't, because a quarter of your students aren't graduating in June because they're failing. Something's not working. And so what can they do differently? And I'm not saying that us doing things differently as educators will suddenly make every student successful, but it's giving them a lifeline and an opportunity to do so. One way to do this, let's go back to our social capital, right? This is a culturally relevant teaching strategy. So you've had a student come in at the beginning of your course, the beginning of your class, or you've met somebody as an internship, or you've employed somebody, and you ask them what they have access to, what is their capital. And so now, as you get to know them, you know the things they want to be able to do, and you can say, well, who's on your list that's good at that? Who do you know that has access to that? And if the answer is nobody, right back to the idea where we combine our resources. We combine my capital and yours, and we find somebody to make that happen for you. So what do I want to know? And it could be as simple as you're in a college class, you're in Math 110, you're in English 103, you've got to master how to write a thesis statement or how to do statistics. You find someone in your class that does really well at that, and they become your capital. You can use them or access them or utilize them. So it could be as simple as that. It could be something on a much larger scale where we're looking for professional internships. You're asking, you want to do something as a student. And so for the students in this room, for those of you that want access to an internship, you want access to a particular class or school, right? There are people in this room at this very moment that can say, I could get you placed in that school. You just need to talk to me. So we know like the capital is around us. And so by asking our students this and by learning about them on this level, we can provide them avenues and bridges back to the capital they need to be successful. So simple ways to change, right? And I say simple, and I say that somewhat with a not so simple realization that nothing happens simply. Change does not happen simply. But these are some ways that we could start right now to work with our students and to meet their needs on a much more personal, academic, and social level. Change your lesson plans. If what you're doing isn't working, change it. Do something different. Find a different way. Find a different piece of literature to bring in. I added the music just recently this week. We were talking about how do we use music to break the silence and craft a space for people to feel like they belong. So I was like, I'm going to start this music thing. It's the middle of the semester. But we started it, right? I changed something because it's working. Student input on expectations, and we hear this a lot sometimes in grade schools. Like, what do you think should be your penalty if you get out of your seat too many times or you don't behave at carpet time? But you can also do that as you grow at this level. What are some expectations you think should be maintained in a classroom setting like this? It works at the collegiate level, right? Getting their input and getting their feedback for what works in a classroom empowers them. They're like, I have a voice and somebody's listening. Richard.
Speaking of like input and expectations, I actually remember in high school I had one teacher who, if you broke one of the school rules, you had a choice. You could either go to the office to have them deal with it, or you could take his personal punishment, which was a wall sit, for a time period depending on what the infraction was. And many people chose to do the wall sit.
Wow. That an exercise, right? Where you're using the strength of your legs, which he probably thought he was like giving them a way out, because like now you don't have to go to the office. But that might be considered corporal punishment on some level, right, Terry? That's probably not.
It's people with different abilities. Because it's either you go to the office or you do this exercise.
So back to the teachers we have who don't know what they don't know. Go ahead, Terry.
Having been in educational administration for a long time and a principal for a long time, I would probably I would certainly caution future educators because I picture the parent in my office saying, can you show me where that is in your discipline code and why this teacher is subjecting them to this corporal punishment. You make it much bigger than it is, of course.
Yeah.
And along that same line too, you have to be very careful, because I think it's a terrific idea to start out with music and have these rich discourse with students.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're teaching in schools, you have to be mindful of the fact that you have a responsibility to reflect the culture of that community. So some things that would be very acceptable in one community, and this isn't anything Dr. Barry's making up, this is how the laws are within Pennsylvania. So what may be clearly acceptable in one area might not be acceptable in another. And if you get 5 guys on a school board to agree that what you did was unacceptable, you could be out of a position.
Yeah.
So all of these things are outstanding, and I think that you really have to do some soul searching. You have to do some understanding. I think what I like best about this is that you're reflecting on yourself internally and understanding how is my background, my perception, my understanding impacting this class, perhaps without me even knowing it, and what can I get from my students that I can address their needs from their culture and their areas.
And I mean, lesson plans, at the collegiate level, we have a lot more flexibility, right? But when you're in a high school classroom or a middle school, you're bound by curriculum. You're bound by a certain set of standards that you must fulfill, that you must meet at the end of the semester or the quarter or the year, and there's the standardized test that comes along with it that proves you did it or you didn't. So there are definitely some guidelines that work against you in some of these areas, so that's when it becomes the artful practice of the educator to figure out ways, well, how can I work this in without breaking the school culture or without failing to fulfill the standard curriculum that is being required of me. I saw a hand over here. Nick, did you have your hand up?
It was about a different question, but it's in the past now. So
it's in the past?
It's irrelevant.
Okay. Well, if it becomes relevant again, throw your hand up. All right?
Okay.
All right. Yes?
I taught the first year experience class last semester. Very diverse class, and one of their first assignments was to do a music assignment where they played music. It was a way of introducing themselves. And what was interesting about that is that it really did bring the class together because we learned that music crosses cultural barriers, so to speak. So a lot of them were playing the same music. And they said, oh no, is it okay if I play a song that has this word in it or this word? And I mean, you talk about reflection, and I thought, well, and then I came to that same realization that you did, that this is their music, right? This is what they're listening to. And so, yeah, it was pretty explicit, you know, and they're all looking at me to see how I'm reacting. And then we got into this fantastic conversation about, you know, what do those words mean to us now? What do they mean to you, and why do you think they're being used? And another thing I noticed about all those songs is that they all had a some kind of social conscience, a political awareness. And so we had, I think that led into some of the most frank discussions about race and privilege I have ever experienced in my 22 years of teaching.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And of course, and if you know me, and much like Professor Selving, the music is the starting point, right? And then you start talking about the different lenses, the different implications, the social context of it all. And sometimes right here, right, we don't know how to address those topics when they're a bit sensitive. We don't know what language to use. We don't know what words to use. And I have found that when I find I am ignorant in an area or I'm not sure what to say or how to phrase it without offending, I will tell them, I'm a white woman. That is my identity. That is my culture. So I don't know if what I'm going to say will be offensive to you. Tell me if it is, or how do I phrase it so that it's not? So I own my identity first, and I own my ignorances, essentially, my deficiencies, so to speak. And I tell them, teach me how to speak about this topic without being offensive or without being unclear in any way. And I tell them exactly up front what it is I don't know about a subject so that they can better inform me. So I would like, and you're doing this now, but I would like to continue some other ideas that you think, either as a student, what are some things you would like to see maybe a little bit different? Or what do you see changing in your classrooms? What do you think needs to change in your classroom? And as educators, those of us that are here, and I love that we have different perspectives. We have leadership perspectives, we have collegiate. We have all sorts of perspectives in this room. So what's changing? What needs to continue to change? What sort of ideas do you have that can help, process this change and help implement this change? So I'll either invite you to talk amongst yourself, or if anybody has an idea they want to share out right now. I saw a hand in the back.
I think one thing that has impacted me, but will also impact other people, is just the rapid change in language and cultural differences in language. I went away for 9 months and lived on a farm, and I came back and language was completely different. I have 2 siblings in high school, and they're still teaching me things that I missed last year, that new slang words were coming up, and they're still teaching me them. They're like 2 years behind. Like, where have you been? I'm like, I don't know. But I think it's good to be very aware of the different changes that will happen in schools. And as teachers, we might not always be exposed to maybe like the back room or the locker room language where slang might occur, or where it's all created. We might not be aware of that because now we're in our 30s or 40s and we're not constantly interacting with students.
So I ask them all the time. I found out yitten and chicken both mean money. I learned that today. So I was like, what? So I yitten. If you don't have the yitten, you just don't buy it. I'm like, have the what? So I ask the questions about the things I don't know. So I encourage educators to always stay frank with your students and ask the questions. You had your hand up, young man.
Yeah, one thing I've definitely noticed going through school and now, one thing that's been changing a lot has definitely been special education, for the better I'd say, because when I first started school in elementary school, school was really hard and I didn't want to do it at all. And once teachers started to get more of an idea of how to help kids with IEPs or 5 and 4 plans, they were able to help me as a visual learner do different kind of things so I could learn in school and enjoy it more. And now like I'm in college, so like I feel like over the course of 12 years, it's gotten way better.
And I love that you said that, and I think it's important. Culture is inclusive of all parts of identity. It is race and it is gender. It's also ability level. It's all of those things that make an individual an individual. So when we're being responsive on a cultural level, it includes IEPs and 504s and special education. So thank you for sharing that. I saw another hand somewhere back here. Go ahead.
So in high school, I had a teacher, and every semester for like the past like 20 or 30 years that he's been teaching, he asked the students slang words, and every year he would write them down on a sheet of paper, and then he would bring them out when we did the assignment, and we would compare what those words meant over the course.
Decades.
Yes, and it was really cool and really fun.
Wow. And that's a neat way to see how language changes over time. That's really a phenomenal activity. I love that. Anybody else about ways that they're, yes, go ahead.
So going off of the talk about slang, for my student teaching placement, I'm in 10th grade English Honors 2. I'm currently teaching Antigone by Sophocles, which is a 2,000-plus-year-old play. And the scariest part was for me to try to figure out how to get my 15 and 16-year-old students to connect to that play. So I ended up, we had, one of the learning targets was to understand a choral ode and paraphrase it. So I had them modernize a scene to their language, create an iMovie, or they could act it out in front of the class. And once they were able to modernize it, they lit up. The students loved it. They came out of their shells. My quiet students, I would have never expected the performances that I saw, but just making the connections to their language now and reflecting on what language was like 2,000 years ago, it definitely made an impact in the classroom.
Which goes back to the argument to support that young woman who said, my language isn't valued. And so that's giving her a space to feel value in her own words, in her own language. I would like to address if there are any questions from the floor or any other comments. Did you want to make a comment, or were you just stretching, Gab? Oh, you tricked me. Yes?
I think I was looking at the what can you do.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like for the best way to go about it is for the teachers and the students and the parents and everybody to kind of come together to make almost like an open-minded kind of community where teachers can bring up maybe sensitive topics or slang, or students can ask the bigger questions and get a discussion going. Like I know we talked about when we hopefully become teachers of like if we get through all our lesson plans, we'd make like half of Friday's lesson into just discussions about life or about any topics that the students would want to talk about.
I like that idea, giving them a space once again. And so that's one of the most important things for students to feel like they have, so that they feel a sense of value. Because their cultural perception of themselves oftentimes, back to Chris Emden's quote, they lack sometimes the self-esteem because nobody's ever really given them value or intention with their own ideas. And so giving them that space is really empowering.
Kind of going off that, in high school I had an English class where every Friday we would do Philosophy Friday. So it was basically we'd come to the classroom and sit in a circle and just talk about stuff like diversity in the classroom and all these kinds of issues. And it was just very eye-opening because you got to hear everybody's perspective on it, because everybody in the classroom had a different background, different story behind them. And it allowed you to see all these different ideas, and it helps you embrace them and kind of step in their shoes and just see where they were coming from for certain situations.
How many of you have read To Kill a Mockingbird? I mean, most of the adults, I'm sure, but a lot of the students, right? And that's one of the famous quotes, right? Like, you never really understand a person until you walk around in their skin. And so that idea of seeing something from a different perspective, changing, not necessarily even changing, but maybe considering a different perspective or perception of a scenario, knowing that there's more than one truth. Any other last minutes? What can you do? What do you want to see done? Yes?
How do you students go into the workforce And like this exercise is great because based on where they're coming from and their mindset, they may be going into an environment that they're not quite ready for. So what kind of things can be done in the academic environment to help sensitize them to this transition?
Internships are one that come to mind immediately for me, or even pairing them up with a community member or partner that we have as a university, even if it's not a full internship, but days or hours at their facility or at their business to see what's different here in academia versus what's my expectation in a job role. And so seeing you can also do this sociogram, what are some things you want to know? And like who might you want to get to know on like that might be an expert in that. So then you have that information and you can start plugging them in with people that can benefit them or further that intention.
So one thing that we're doing in the college that is trying to make those connections for our students that are at poverty line or below the poverty line, and offering poverty simulations through our local partner with Pocono Alliance, just to give that perspective. I think giving our students just more opportunities to see life from different angles and lenses is what's probably the easiest thing for us to do, and seek out those opportunities.
And Dean Barry, there's also another one, See the Able, Not the Label, right? There's another disability conference that's coming up, almost like a simulator type with some activities, what it would be like to live with a particular disability. So we're putting them in touch with different ways of living or different practices, and so it goes from there, and it can also be internships and professional endeavors we can connect them with outside. So, which is something I think we should always be paying attention to, what they want out of this and where they want to go. So any others? I mean, change takes time, and so like that's the thing I want to leave you with. Nothing's going to happen in an instant, and nothing's going to happen if it doesn't have a voice. So as students, you have the power to say to your professors, can we do this a different way? As future educators, you have the voice and the power to say to your administrator, ask, right, permission first, can we do it this way so that you don't end up in that penalty box or on the wall. So you can start to look for ways like, how can I make this change? What can I do? And understand it will take time. So that patience that is required, so results might not be seen right away, but continuing to invest your time. You are the agent, right? I talk a lot about change agents. That's sort of my hashtag, even though I'm not on Twitter, I just made one up. So change agents is what I always encourage. Like, be the difference. You are the one that can be the difference in a student's life, or a neighbor's life, or a friend's life, or a relative's life. So a parting thought, Ignacio Estrada, if a child can't learn the way we teach, maybe we should teach the way they learn. So that's all I have for you this evening. If you want to stick around, you have any questions, I'd be happy to discuss further.